Welcome to Earth, Analyst. Tonight, we're traveling far back into a world of golden sands, towering monuments, and timeless mysteries. A world where the Nile was more than a river, it was life itself. This is ancient Egypt, a land of pharaohs, pyramids, and gods who walked alongside mortals. But tonight, instead of just gazing at its wonders, we'll imagine something different. What if you lived there? What would your days look like? Your nights feel like? Your dreams sound like under the desert sky? In this quiet journey, we'll step into the sandals of an ancient Egyptian, to drift through a life shaped by ritual, rhythm, and eternity itself. It is the record of a people who wove their lives around gods and spirits, deities of the river that nourished them, of the boundless sky above, of the black soil that yielded crops, and of the secret worlds that waited after death. In their myths lived stories of birth and ending, of falcons that soared like kings of the air, and jackals that roamed as guardians of the underworld. Thrones were lost and regained, and each tale carried meaning that shaped their world. For the Egyptians, these were never just stories to pass the time. They were the very rhythm of existence. Each season of planting, every ritual of offering, and even the softest prayer was bound tightly to these beliefs. Their understanding of life's beginning and its inevitable end was always tied to the divine. To imagine their world is to imagine a place where faith was as present as the desert wind. If the slower flow of these words brings you calm, you can let it be an invitation to rest. Picture a night where oil lamps glow gently and stone walls flicker with firelight shadows, while statues stand watch in silence across the land of the Nile. Myth was not separate from daily life. It was the order itself. It ruled the path of the sun across the sky, the rising flood of the river, and the rebirth of the fertile fields, the movements of the stars, the change of the seasons, and the very authority of kings were all explained through myth. For those who lived between the desert and the river's edge, these stories were not simply entertainment. They were anchors of certainty, sources of comfort, and promises that the world was steady, ordered, and eternal. The Egyptian pantheon was vast, filled with countless deities, yet each had a place within a carefully shaped order. To them, the sky was not emptiness, but the goddess Nut, her body arching protectively across the heavens. Beneath her lay Geb, the god of the earth, firm and enduring. Between them was Shu, the breath of air, holding sky and ground apart to make room for life. From the endless waters of Nun, the dark chaos before time, arose Adam, the first self-created god, who set the unfolding of existence into motion. From him came Shu, the air, and Tefnut, and together they gave birth to Geb and Nut. Their children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, became the central figures of Egypt's sacred dramas, tales of love and betrayal, of life and death, of chaos met with order. This sacred family, known as the Ennead of Heliopolis, shaped the Egyptian vision of the cosmos. Through them, the rising sun, the swelling of the Nile, and the eternal struggle between harmony and disorder were explained. For the Egyptians, creation was not a single moment in the distant past, but a cycle, an eternal rhythm that renewed itself each day. Every sunrise was a sign of renewal, proof that life had begun again. The sun god Ra was believed to journey across the sky in his golden boat, a solar bark that carried light to the world. When night fell, he entered the dangerous underworld, where hidden gates, restless spirits, and monstrous serpents waited to stop him. High EF. Among the dangers that lurked in the night was Apophis, the immense serpent of chaos. His coils were said to stretch endlessly, a living embodiment of darkness, striving to devour the light and return the cosmos to silence. Every dawn, when the first pale glow touched the horizon, it was proof that Ra had fought his way through the underworld and risen again. Yet this was never a final victory. It was a fragile triumph, one that needed to be earned every night, renewed by struggle and devotion. Temples across Egypt were built in harmony with the sun's path, their very stones aligned to its rising and setting. As the first rays broke over the desert, priests would chant hymns, lifting their voices to strengthen Ra in his battles. Ordinary men and women also carried faith in their hearts, believing that their whispered prayers, their offerings of bread, incense, and song, helped to tip the balance against the forces of chaos. In this way, the divine was never distant. Gods and humans were bound together in mutual need. Even the mightiest deity relied on mortal devotion, just as kings depended on loyal subjects, and families leaned upon one another for survival. Existence itself was understood as a collaboration between heaven and earth, spirit and flesh. Among the deities most cherished was Osiris, lord of the fertile earth, ruler of the green life that sprouted after the Nile's floods, and sovereign of the underworld where souls journeyed after death. He was envisioned with skin the color of new plants, clothed in white wrappings, and holding the crook and flail, the symbols of rulership and care. Osiris stood beside his beloved consort and sister, Isis, a goddess of magic, motherhood, and devotion. Together they embodied abundance, renewal, and enduring love. But harmony has always been shadowed by envy. Their brother Set, god of storms, desert winds, and raw violence, burned with jealousy. His heart hardened against Osiris, whose popularity and gentle reign drew the loyalty of gods and mortals alike. Determined to usurp him, Set devised a cunning plan. He ordered the making of a magnificent chest, crafted with dazzling workmanship and measured to Osiris's exact form. The box was presented at a grand feast, a gift promised to whomever could lie within it perfectly. One after another, guests tried and failed, laughing as they found themselves too small or too large. The air was filled with music and celebration, and in the midst of it, Osiris, unsuspecting, stepped forward. When he reclined inside, the chest closed around him as if it had been waiting all along. At that moment, Set and his conspirators seized their chance. They slammed down the lid, fastened it with iron, and sealed it tight with molten lead. The joyous gathering turned to horror, but before anyone could act, the chest was carried away. Set's men dragged it through the palace, through the streets, and out toward the river. With ruthless force, they cast it into the waters of the Nile, letting the current sweep it out to the great sea. Thus began one of Egypt's most enduring myths, a story not only of betrayal and grief, but also of devotion, resilience, and eventual rebirth. For the ancient Egyptians, death was never an ending. It was a passage, a turning of the cycle, as dependable as the rising of the morning sun. When Osiris reclined within the chest, Seth struck. He forced down the lid, sealed it with molten lead, and hurled it into the Nile. The waters carried Osiris away, and Egypt fell into sorrow. Isis, the embodiment of loyalty and unshaken devotion, refused to surrender to despair. She traveled far and wide, wandering the marshes, deserts, and distant shores, searching for her beloved husband. Songs say she wept so bitterly that the Nile itself rose in sympathy. In some tellings, Seth intercepted the chest, and in his fury tore Osiris into pieces, scattering his body across the land. Yet Isis, aided by her sister Nephthys and the vigilant Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of tombs, searched unceasingly. One by one, they found the fragments. With sacred rites and whispered magic, Isis reassembled her husband. Though Osiris could not return among the living, he was reborn in another realm. He became sovereign of the underworld, a just and noble ruler who presided over the souls of the dead. In his halls, the heart of every mortal was weighed against the feather of Mat, truth and order itself. Justice was his throne, and eternity his kingdom. From the union of Osiris and Isis came Horus, the falcon-headed child of destiny. His life carried the burden of vengeance and renewal. Horus was born to challenge Seth and reclaim the harmony that had been broken. The struggle between the two gods did not unfold as a single battle, but as a long series of contests. They fought on the river and in the desert, before councils of gods, and in the silence of sacred temples. Their conflict was both physical and symbolic, a struggle of strength, wisdom, and divine right. Horus was young, yet guided by Isis's cunning. Seth was ruthless, brutal, and often deceitful. At times, victory seemed to tilt toward Seth. In one version, Horus lost an eye to his uncle's savage blows, but Thoth, the god of wisdom, restored it, and the healed eye became something greater than before. The eye of Horus, a sign of wholeness and protection, came to embody health, balance, and completeness. Worn as an amulet, it was a shield against misfortune, a promise of safety in both life and death. In the end, Horus prevailed. The Council of Gods declared him rightful heir to Osiris, and Seth was subdued. Yet Seth was never entirely destroyed. Chaos could not be banished forever. It could only be restrained. In this balance, Egyptians saw a profound truth. Order must be guarded each day, just as Ra's light must rise anew. Ra's light must rise anew. From this myth came the very foundation of kingship. Every pharaoh was seen as Horus incarnate, the living god who upheld the balance of truth, justice, and harmony against the tide of disorder. To the people of the Nile, these stories were far more than tales. They were guiding truths, woven into every harvest, every festival, every stone carved beneath the desert sun. They explained the rhythms of nature, gave authority to rulers, and offered comfort when death came close. And death was always near. In Egypt, the afterlife was never an afterthought. It was the center of belief. From the humblest villager to the mightiest pharaoh, tombs were prepared with care. Food, tools, amulets, and carved texts were placed beside the body, tokens meant to guide and protect the soul on its journey. Papyrus scrolls, or wall inscriptions from the Book of the Dead, served as maps of the unseen, filled with prayers and spells to light the path. The voyage through the Duat, the realm of the dead, was perilous. The soul faced gates and guardians, serpents and rivers of fire. Each challenge required words of power to pass unharmed. But if the traveler endured, the journey ended in the Hall of Mat, where Osiris presided with 42 divine judges at his side. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Mot, goddess of truth and order. If the heart proved heavier, burdened with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, the devourer of souls, a fearsome beast with the jaws of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the haunches of a hippopotamus. There was no second chance, only final destruction. But if the heart was found in balance, the soul passed onward into the field of reeds, a paradise that mirrored Egypt at its most abundant. Their families reunited, crops grew in endless harvests, and the Nile's waters flowed without end. Eternal life was not abstract but familiar, a perfected reflection of home. Temples, too, reflected this balance of life and eternity. They were not simply houses of prayer, but cosmic engines, designed to maintain harmony between the divine and mortal worlds. Their very layout mirrored the universe itself. The massive pylons at their gates symbolized the horizon, where the sun rose each morning. Passing inward, the open courtyards stood for the earthly realm, where common people could gather. Deeper still lay the hypostyle halls, forests of stone columns carved as lotus and papyrus, evoking the primeval marshes from which creation had once emerged. At the very heart was the sanctuary, hidden from public eyes, a chamber of creation itself. Here, the statue of the god was kept, cared for as though it were alive. Priests performed the daily rites not as empty ritual, but as necessity. Each dawn, they awakened the deity with hymns, washed the statue, clothed it in fine linen, and set offerings of bread, beer, and incense. By these acts, the gods were nourished, and through them, Egypt was sustained. Though ordinary people could not enter the sanctuary, they shared in the divine through festivals and processions. On holy days, the god's image was lifted from its hidden chamber, placed upon gilded boats, and carried through the streets or floated on the Nile. Music, drums, and chants filled the air, uniting the city with the divine presence. Among the deities most closely bound to death and rebirth was Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian. He presided over mummification, overseeing the sacred work that preserved the body. Through his care, the soul could recognize its vessel in eternity. To invoke Anubis was to ensure safe passage into the mysteries beyond death, and his shadow was present at every burial, from the grandest tomb to the simplest grave. Priests in jackal masks performed the sacred role of Anubis. They wrapped the bodies of the dead in layers of linen, anointed them with fragrant oils, and spoke the words of protection that would guide the soul through its journey. To the Egyptians, the color black linked with Anubis was not a symbol of despair, but of fertility and rebirth, like the rich silt left behind after the Nile's floods. Anubis was not feared. He was honored as a compassionate guardian, watching over the scales of judgment, ensuring that every heart was measured with fairness against the feather of Mat. Another beloved figure was Hathor, goddess of joy, love, and motherhood. She was shown with the ears of a cow, or crowned with horns that held the solar disk between them. Hathor embodied both the gentleness of a mother and the radiant warmth of the sun. In her temples, music echoed, sistrums rattled, drums thundered, and dancers moved in her honor. She was patroness of women in childbirth, protector of infants, and source of nourishment. Her blessing was sought for safety, abundance, and love. Hathor's care stretched beyond family and home. She was also the guardian of travelers, extending her presence across the vast deserts. In her company, loneliness softened into comfort, and sorrow transformed into laughter. To honor Hathor was to embrace the sweetness of life itself, not only in the solemnity of temples, but also in feasts, in songs, and in the tender bond between parent and child. Wisdom and knowledge were embodied in Thoth, the ibis-headed master of writing. Holding his reed pen and palette, he recorded laws, rituals, and the judgments of the gods. It was said that Thoth invented hieroglyphs, gifting humanity the power to speak with both mortals and the divine, to carve memory into stone and carry prayers into eternity. To the Egyptians, writing was never ordinary. It was a form of magic, shaping reality through symbols. Priests invoked Thoth for accuracy in rituals. Scribes called upon him for eloquence in texts. Astronomers sought his guidance to chart the stars, track the movements of the moon, and measure the cycles of time. Thoth was keeper of balance, ensuring that the sacred calendar and cosmic order aligned. In the myths, he often appeared as mediator, settling quarrels among the gods with reason and clarity. At the judgment of souls, it was Thoth who stood at Osiris's side, carefully recording the outcome of the scales, impartial and precise. His words ensured that justice was never compromised. If Thoth was the embodiment of calm reason, Sekhmet was the incarnation of raw fury. Lion-headed and fierce, she was said to have been born from the fiery eye of Ra himself. When humans rebelled against the gods, Ra unleashed her as a weapon of divine wrath. Her roars shook the desert. Her breath burned like flame. Armies were broken beneath her rage. Yet Sekhmet was not only destruction, she was also a healer. The same divine fire that destroyed could cleanse, purify, and restore. In temples, she was honored as patroness of medicine. Priests invoked her to banish illness, to drive away plague, and to renew the body's strength. She was both punishment and protection, both the searing desert sun and its life-giving warmth. Her priests were healers, channeling her fierce energy into medicine, incantations, and cures. To calm her temper, great festivals were held. Music and laughter filled the air, and jars of beer dyed red to resemble blood were poured out in abundance. As people drank and danced, Sekhmet's rage was believed to soften, turning her from destroyer into protector. She embodied duality. The same lioness who clawed in fury could also shield in compassion. Balancing her ferocity was Bastet, the cat-headed goddess of tenderness and home. Where Sekhmet brought fire and fear, Bastet brought warmth and comfort. Across Egypt, cats were cherished as her sacred companions, guardians against vermin, and carriers of divine blessing. Temples dedicated to Bastet overflowed with bronze cat figurines and offerings of devotion. Families believed her gentle presence brought joy, safety, and fertility into their homes. Yet, Bastet too carried strength. Just as a cat might sit quietly in sunlight and strike with sudden precision, Bastet represented the truth that nurturing and defense were not opposites, but complements. In her, gentleness and power were woven together, The Nile itself was honored as a god Hapi, lord of the flood and bringer of fertility. Each year his waters rose and spread across the fields, turning barren earth into lush farmland. Hymns praised Hapi as the sustainer of life, the one who delivered grain, fish, and abundance. He was shown as a plump, androgynous figure, symbolizing nourishment and plenty. His yearly return was celebrated as a festival of joy, a promise that Egypt would endure. Farmers trusted his rhythm, sowing their seeds in the wet soil after the floods, certain that his gift would not fail. Without Hapi, no crops could grow, no people could thrive. To honor him was to honor survival itself. At the very heart of all belief stood Mat, both goddess and eternal principle. She was truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. Her image was simple yet profound, a woman crowned with a single ostrich feather, the very symbol of harmony. Without Mat, the world would unravel into chaos. Pharaohs ruled as guardians of Mat, presenting her image to the gods as proof of their devotion to order. To uphold Mat was the sacred duty of rulers and people alike, an endless task of keeping the universe in balance, ensuring that the sun would rise, the Nile would flow, and life would continue in its eternal cycle. To live by Mat was to live with integrity, to act with honesty, to treat others fairly, and to maintain harmony within family, community, and the wider kingdom. Her feather crowned the scales of the afterlife, set against each human heart. A heart heavy with greed, cruelty, or falsehood would fail. A heart light with truth would pass into eternity. In every sunrise that broke over the desert, in every law proclaimed, and in every ritual performed, Egyptians saw the hand of Mat. She was not an idea, but the very fabric of existence, the invisible thread that held creation together. To defy Mat was to invite collapse. To uphold her was to ensure the rhythm of life endured. Pharaohs embodied this sacred duty. They were not merely rulers, but living gods in mortal form. In life, each pharaoh was Horus, the falcon, protector of the land. In death, he became Osiris, lord of the underworld. Pharaohs stood on the threshold between humanity and divinity, guardians of balance, who carried the responsibility of keeping chaos at bay. Their crowns, rituals, and monuments were more than symbols of power. They were instruments of cosmic stability. When a pharaoh spoke, his words were believed to carry the weight of divine command. His presence was not just political, it was celestial. Through him, the people trusted that the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and the heavens themselves would remain in order. The great pyramids were not built as vanity, but as vessels of eternity. Rising out of the desert with perfect geometry, they were stairways to the sky. Each stone was laid as part of a dialogue with the cosmos. Their sloping sides pointed toward the horizon where the sun was reborn, and their alignments with stars reflected the eternal order of heaven inside. Chambers held treasures, food, texts, and sacred amulets, carefully placed to ensure the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife was secure. To step into those passages was to step into a vision of eternity, dark, silent, and yet filled with the promise of rebirth among the gods. These monuments were not built by nameless slaves, but by thousands of skilled workers, stonecutters, architects, artists, and farmers who labored during the flood season when fields lay underwater. They were paid in bread. For them, building was devotion, and every block raised was an offering of faith. Even now, the pyramids whisper of ambition and belief. They are the shadows of a civilization reaching for the eternal, etched against the desert sky. Guarding this sacred plateau stands the great Sphinx, half lion, half human, carved from living rock. Its weathered face, part king, part guardian, still radiates majesty. To the ancients, it was a sentinel at the edge of the known world, a protector watching over both tombs and horizons. Legends spoke of its silence, of riddles and secrets it would not reveal. To pass beneath its gaze was to step across the boundary between the mortal and the paternal, and underlying all of this was Heka magic. But in Egypt, magic was not superstition or illusion. It was the living energy of existence, the unseen current that connected gods, humans, and nature. Every spell, every ritual, every carving in stone was believed to awaken Heka, that gave words their power, that allowed humans to commune with gods. It was in the physician's charm, in the priest's hymn, in the farmer's prayer. To live in Egypt was to live in a world where the divine and the human were never separate, where each sunrise was a miracle and every breath part of an eternal cycle. Even the gods themselves wielded Heka. Humans, too, drew upon it in the quiet rituals of daily life. Mothers whispered protective charms over sleeping children. Healers spoke words over wounds, binding flesh with spells as surely as with bandages. Fishermen sang prayers into the water, asking the river to guide its bounty into their nets. Farmers placed small offerings before the fields, blessing the soil before the plow cut its furrows. Priests, trained in secret knowledge, called upon Heka to bless harvests, to heal the sick, to shield temples from chaos. Writing itself was infused with magic. The hieroglyph was not just a letter, but a living symbol. To carve a bird, a flame, or an eye into stone was to call forth its spirit. Words could wound, words could heal, words could open doors between the mortal and divine. To the Egyptians, there was no border between religion and magic. Both were threads woven into the same eternal fabric. Through Heka, they believed the cosmos was not fixed, but continuously created, sustained, and renewed. Each ritual, each prayer, each offering was not repetition, but participation in keeping the universe alive. Amulets and sacred objects filled Egyptian life with unseen power. The ankh-looped cross of eternity was worn close to the chest, granting breath without end. The scarab beetle, rolling its ball of earth, became a mirror of the rising sun, symbol of rebirth and resilience. The Djed pillar, tall and steady, was Osiris's spine, strength that endured even in death. These were not trinkets or decorations, but living prayers, worn on bodies, carved into tomb walls, tucked into the wrappings of the dead. Even colors carried voices. Green spoke of growth and resurrection. Gold shimmered with the brilliance of divinity, as eternal as the sun. Black, far from sorrow, was the fertile rebirth of the Nile's soil. Every detail of art, every brush of paint, every chisel's mark was chosen with intention, ensuring that divine presence flowed through all creation. Daily life itself was steeped in this sacred view. Nothing was ordinary. A cup of water from the Nile was a gift from Hapi. A loaf of bread carried the blessing of the goddess Renutet. The rising of the sun was Ra's triumph over night. To eat, to breathe, to work the fields, all were extensions of the eternal rhythm. Death was never feared, only prepared for. It was not an ending, but a transition, a journey onward. Even the humblest tomb, carved from simple stone, was filled with food, amulets, and tokens of love. Families painted protective prayers upon walls, ensuring that the soul would not wander lost, but would walk safely toward eternity in the evenings. When the desert air cooled and lamps flickered in clay bowls of oil, families gathered in the hush of twilight. Elders told stories of gods and kings, of Horus and Isis, of courage, loyalty, and wisdom. These tales were not idle entertainments, but teachings, guides for living, lessons in morality, and hope against the darkness. To live in Egypt was to live each day as part of a cosmic story, where every action echoed into eternity. When storms swept across the desert, raising dust and fire in the sky, the Egyptians did not see chance or weather. They saw Seth, the restless god of chaos, raging with unquenchable fury. When cleverness triumphed over raw force, it was said to be Isis guiding events with her cunning wisdom. And when the sun rose each morning, painting the horizon with gold, it was not merely light returning, it was Ra's victory, proof that darkness had been driven back once again. Children grew up hearing these truths as naturally as others might learn seasons or numbers. They learned that the eye of Horus, once torn and healed, was a sign of protection, wholeness, and the resilience of life. They were told that Osiris, though slain and dismembered, rose again, and that this resurrection was a promise written into the cosmos. Death was not final, but a doorway to eternity. From Isis they learned loyalty, patience, and devotion. From Ma'at, the call to fairness, honesty, and balance. These were not distant tales locked away in temples. They were living patterns woven into every field, every market, every home. To tell a myth was not to pass the time, but to rehearse the values of Egypt itself. It was to remind the listener that struggle had purpose, that every loss bore the seed of renewal, that every ending concealed the roots of another beginning. As the centuries unfolded, the reach of Egypt's gods extended beyond the Nile, through caravans of trade, through conquest and exchange. The deities found new voices in foreign lands. Temples to Isis rose on Mediterranean shores. She was adored not only as queen and wife, but as universal mother, savior, and protector of sailors braving treacherous seas. Her worship carried across Greece, Rome, and far beyond. Thoth, master of writing and wisdom, was merged with Hermes to become Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great sage. His teachings inspired philosophers, alchemists, and mystics, shaping traditions that lived long after hieroglyphs grew silent. Egyptian thought did not vanish, it transformed, taking root in the hearts of distant peoples who recognized its depth. Even when new empires rose, when temples crumbled into sand and priests faded into memory, Egypt's essence endured. Its symbols remained. The Ankh, sign of eternal life, continued to whisper of immortality. The scarab, humble yet divine, rolled through art, an amulet as a sign of rebirth. The eye of Horus, bright and unblinking, watched over ships, markets, and households centuries after the last pharaoh was gone. To later philosophers, poets, and seekers, Egypt was a wellspring of timeless truth. They did not dismiss its myths as superstition, but embraced them as profound metaphors. Out of watery chaos comes creation. Out of conflict, the balance of order against disorder. Out of death, the promise of renewal. These ideas were seen not as the heritage of one people, but as truths that belonged to all humanity. Yet, for the Egyptians themselves, these were never metaphors. They were living reality. The river was Hapi's gift, lifeblood flowing through the land. The pharaoh was not simply king, but Horus in the flesh, the bridge between heaven and earth. The desert was not an empty wilderness, but a realm alive with spirits, guardians, and unseen powers. The world itself was sacred, every sunrise a victory, every breath an echo of the gods. To walk in Egypt was to live in a land where the divine was never distant. It shimmered in the heat of the sun, glowed in the cool light of the moon, stirred in the rush of the Nile, and spoke in the hush of the desert wind. Eternity was not beyond reach, it was present in every moment. The stars were not distant fires in the sky, but divine presences, each one a traveler in the endless sea of night. Egyptians did not see themselves as bystanders in this cosmic order. They were participants. To live was to aid Ra in his daily battle against darkness, to uphold Mat in every action, and to prepare for the judgment that would shape eternal destiny. Funeral rites reflected this certainty. Death was not an ending, but a voyage, a crossing into Duat, the unseen realm of shadows and passageways, leading at last to the field of reeds. Families prepared their loved ones with tenderness and devotion. Bodies were bathed in sacred oils, wrapped in clean linen, and blessed with whispered prayers. Each step was deliberate, each word a bridge between the living and the dead. Amulets were placed carefully among the wrappings, not as ornaments, but as tools of survival. Scarabs rested near the heart, guarding the soul's renewal. Eyes of Horus ensured vision in the darkness ahead. Ankhs promised eternal breath. Priests, often masked as Anubis, chanted spells from the Book of the Dead, guiding the spirit past gates, guardians, and trials. Tombs became treasure houses for eternity. Loaves of bread, jars of beer, cuts of meat, and baskets of fruit were left beside the dead, ensuring that hunger would never trouble them in the next world. Scenes painted on walls did not depict memories of what once had been, but visions of what was yet to come. Fields of barley ready for harvest, families feasting together, boats gliding peacefully on the Nile's calm waters. At the heart of the journey stood the Hall of Mat, the threshold where truth was measured. Osiris, green of skin and white of robe, sat upon his throne, crowned with the tall Atef crown. Before him lay the scales of justice. On one side rested the feather of Mat, symbol of perfect balance. On the other lay the heart of the deceased, carrying the weight of every deed, word, and thought. Anubis watched closely, steady hands guiding the scales. Thoth, master of wisdom and writing, stood nearby, recording the outcome with divine precision. The judgment was final and absolute. If the heart balanced with the feather, the soul was declared pure and granted eternal life. But if the heart weighed heavy with falsehood and sin, it was cast to Ammit the devourer, a beast with the jaws of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the haunches of a hippopotamus. To be swallowed by Ammit was not torment. but obliteration and erasure from existence itself. This vision gave meaning to every breath of life. Wealth, rank, or fame could not alter the scales. Only truth, fairness, and harmony preserved the heart's lightness. Each act of kindness, each honest word, each fulfillment of duty was a thread woven into the tapestry of eternity. Beyond judgment lay the reward, the field of reeds, Egypt's vision of paradise. It was not an abstract heaven, but a perfected mirror of the world they knew. Families were reunited. The fields yielded grain without end. The Nile's waters flowed clear and gentle, never failing in their promise of abundance. Here, souls worked and feasted, fished and sailed, much as they had in life. But there was no sickness, no grief, no hunger, and no fear. It was not idleness that was promised, but fulfillment life as it was meant to be. Endless, balanced, and whole. Daily rituals on earth reinforced these beliefs. Farmers offered prayers before plowing. Mothers blessed their children with protective words at nightfall. Priests greeted the sunrise with hymns to Ra, reminding all who listened that the struggle of light against darkness continued, and that their devotion helped secure victory. To live in Egypt was to walk with eternity always near. Every action weighed in the scales of the gods, every moment a rehearsal for the life beyond. Death was not to be dreaded, but prepared for. Not an end, but a continuation, an unbroken path leading back to the eternal order. At dawn, hymns rose with the first light. Priests sang to awaken Ra, greeting the sun as if it were a living god stirring from slumber. At sunset, prayers followed his descent, guiding him safely into the underworld so that he might rise again. Life itself moved in rhythm with his journey. Families honored their ancestors with food, incense, and whispered words, believing the spirits of the departed lingered nearby. Farmers trusted the rising waters of Hapi, the god of the flood, offering gratitude for the life-giving inundation that turned desert into farmland. Children grew up steeped in these practices, taught to recite blessings, to touch protective amulets, to trust in gods who watched, listened, and cared. In each gesture, they upheld Mat, weaving balance and truth into the fabric of daily life. Art and architecture in Egypt reflected this sacred fusion of myth and reality. Tomb paintings were not mere decoration, but guides for the soul maps of the Duat, filled with spells, gates, and guardians. Temples towered with colossal statues, embodiments of divine presence, silent yet watchful. Lotus and papyrus blossomed across carved columns, eternal symbols of rebirth and creation. The walls themselves spoke. Hieroglyphs lined stone surfaces, shimmering not as simple writing, but as spells, living words carved to sustain the world. To inscribe was to enchant, to give permanence to truth. Gold gleamed not for wealth, but to echo the flesh of the gods, shining with immortality. Black granite embodied eternity's strength. Green stones whispered of fertility, growth, and renewal. Every color, every shape carried meaning. Every space was sacred. At the center of it all stood the pharaoh. In rituals, he offered Mat itself to the gods, lifting a small statue of the goddess as a sign of his devotion and worthiness. In festivals, he embodied Horus, protector of the living, and in death, he became Osiris, Lord of eternity. His role was more than political, it was cosmic. The people looked to the pharaoh as a bridge between heaven and earth, a living assurance that chaos would not prevail. Through him, the cycle of the sun and the flood would continue. Through him, the gods would remain close. His monuments were not built for vanity, but for stability. Each pyramid, obelisk, and temple was a cosmic anchor, ensuring that balance would endure through generations. To gaze at a pyramid rising from the desert was to see more than stone. It was to feel connection to the gods, to the eternal order, to the unbroken rhythm of creation itself. The sight inspired loyalty, reverence, and awe. Even today, their massive silhouettes whisper of ambition, devotion, and humanity's longing for permanence. For the Egyptians, every action, every ritual, every monument was part of a greater whole. Life was not separate from myth, but an extension of it. To live was to serve the gods, to honor the ancestors, to uphold Mat, and to prepare for eternity. And in doing so, they believed they helped sustain not just their own world, but the very order of the universe. Even in times of hardship through famine, invasion, or the fall of dynasties, the vision endured. Egypt was upheld by Mat, protected by Horus, renewed by Osiris, and blessed by Ra. Dynasties rose, dynasties fell, yet the myths remained unbroken. Even foreign rulers, once seated on the throne of Egypt, bowed to its traditions. They built temples, offered prayers, and carved their names alongside hieroglyphs that stretched back centuries. Such was the strength of Egyptian belief. It absorbed change without being erased, transforming but never vanishing. The Nile still rose. The sun still returned. The stars still traced their slow, eternal paths across the night sky. In that rhythm, Egyptians found proof that their myths were not merely stories, but eternal truths written into the order of creation itself. To understand Egyptian myth fully, one must step into their temples, vast sanctuaries of stone, where the boundary between earth and heaven was carefully drawn. Each temple was not only a house of the gods, but a universe in miniature. Its walls, corridors, and chambers mapped the story of creation. Passing through its gates, a worshipper retraced the journey from chaos into order, from the outer world into the eternal heart of the divine. At the entrance rose colossal pylons, twin towers symbolizing the mountains of the horizon, the place where the sun was reborn each morning. Their surfaces gleamed with carvings of pharaohs smiting enemies, eternal scenes of order triumphing over chaos. Within lay wide courtyards where common people could gather. Here they brought bread, beer, and flowers, gifts of gratitude for gods who gave them life. Deeper inside stretched the hypostyle halls. Rows of towering columns rose like a stone forest, their surfaces alive with painted hieroglyphs and sacred images. Dim light filtered through narrow openings, illuminating clouds of incense that drifted toward the ceiling. To walk here was to feel the transition between the human and the divine, a preparation for what lay ahead. At the very heart stood the sanctuary, the holiest chamber. Small, dark, and silent, it housed the sacred statue of the god, a figure believed to be more than an image. To the Egyptians, it was alive, inhabited by divine presence. Only priests and the pharaoh himself could enter this chamber. Each morning, they awakened the god with ceremony. The statue was washed in pure water, anointed with fragrant oils, clothed in fine linen, and offered a banquet of bread, fruit, meat, and wine. Hymns accompanied every action, words of power sustaining the very fabric of the cosmos. These rituals were not symbolic, they were essential. The gods depended on this devotion, and in turn, the world depended on the gods. To neglect a statue was to risk imbalance, even disaster. For the Egyptians, faith was not passive. It was maintenance of the universe itself. Festivals carried this sacred presence beyond the walls of the temple. On holy days, the statue of the god was placed upon a gilded bark, lifted onto the shoulders of priests, and paraded through the streets. Sometimes it floated along the Nile, shimmering in the sun, followed by boats filled with chanting crowds. The people danced, sang, and offered incense, flowers, and prayers. In these moments, the distance between divine and human dissolved. The gods left their sanctuaries and walked among their people. Such festivals were more than celebration. They were renewal, reminders that Egypt's order, its mat, was alive, upheld by the care of its people, and blessed by the presence of its gods. The gods traveled among their people, blessing them with protection, abundance, and fertility. In every festival, in every prayer, Egyptians felt that the unseen had drawn near. The myths themselves were not merely told, but enacted. When priests chanted the triumph of Horus over Seth, it was no memory of the past. It was the victory happening again in that very moment. By retelling the myth, they ensured its truth lived on. Ritual was performance, but not performance alone. It was power, a bridge between human voices and cosmic renewal. Each gesture, each hymn, each offering was a thread woven into the fabric of eternity. This blending of myth, ritual, and life explains why Egyptian religion endured for over 3,000 years. It was not fragile, nor confined to the temple. It was embedded in the cycles of the world itself, the flood of the Nile, the daily rebirth of the sun, the authority of the pharaoh, the turning of seasons. To live in Egypt was to live inside myth, to wake each morning in a cosmos charged with meaning. Among the deities most beloved was Isis, the goddess of devotion, motherhood, and magic. Her story of love and perseverance, seeking the broken body of Osiris, restoring him through spells and care, resonated deeply. She became the model of loyalty, compassion, and resilience. Women turned to her for fertility and safe childbirth. Mothers prayed for her protection over their children. Sailors called upon her to guide them safely through treacherous waters. Isis's power lay not only in her myth, but in her adaptability. In Egypt, she was the loyal wife, the magical mother. In later centuries, as her worship spread to Greece, Rome, and beyond, she absorbed local traditions, yet remained herself. To some, she was the universal mother. To others, the savior who promised eternal life. Wherever she was invoked, Isis answered, proof that the Egyptian gods were not rigid, but living, capable of transformation. Her son, Horus, embodied kingship and victory. Depicted as a falcon or as a man with a falcon's head, he soared above the Nile, sharp-eyed, vigilant. Each pharaoh declared himself Horus reborn, the living god who safeguarded Egypt against disorder. His mythic battle against Seth, the force of chaos, became the very pattern of kingship. Just as Horus triumphed and restored balance, so too did the pharaoh ensure security and stability. In every coronation, Horus was reborn. In every inscription carved into temple walls, his triumph was declared anew. This was not ancient history to the Egyptians. It was present reality, repeated endlessly, reassuring the people that order had not faltered, that the gods remained watchful, and that life would continue through Isis and Horus, Osiris and Ra, Mat and Hathor. The Egyptians lived in a world where the divine was not far away, but ever present, woven into each sunrise, each harvest, each breath of the desert wind. Though cast as villain in many tales, Seth was never erased from the pantheon. He was chaos, storm, and desert. But the Egyptians knew such forces could never be destroyed, only balanced. In some regions, Seth was even revered as a guardian, standing boldly at the prow of the solar bark, thrusting his spear into Apophis, the serpent of darkness, each night. His dual role reflected a deeper truth. Chaos was dangerous, yet necessary. Opposition itself was part of Mat, provided it remained restrained. Even disorder had a role within harmony. The underworld, known as Duat, embodied this paradox of fear and hope. It was envisioned as a shifting landscape of caverns, rivers, and gates, each guarded by beings with terrifying forms. The soul's journey through this realm was perilous, but never solitary. Equipped with prayers and spells, the traveler carried the words of power from sacred texts, the Book of the Dead, the coffin texts, the Amduat, each acting as a map, a torch in the darkness, a shield against dangers. These writings were more than myth. They were practical instructions for survival in the afterlife. Duat was not only a place of trial, but also of renewal. Each night, Ra himself voyaged through its hidden corridors, descending into shadow, fending off serpents and demons. At midnight, he united with Osiris, drawing strength from the Lord of the Dead, absorbing the essence of eternity itself. From this meeting of sun and underworld, dawn was reborn. Thus, death was not an end, but part of the rhythm that renewed creation for the Egyptians. Morality was both practical and cosmic. To live in accordance with Mat was to safeguard not only society, but one's eternal destiny. Lies, greed, and cruelty weighed down the heart, dragging it toward annihilation at the scales. Truthfulness, generosity, and respect kept it light, able to balance against the feather of Mat. Each act in life echoed into the halls of eternity. Symbols carried these truths into daily existence. The Ankh, looped like a cross with a handle, appeared everywhere in the hands of gods. Carved upon temple walls, worn as amulets close to the chest. It was the breath of life itself, the assurance of eternity. The Eye of Horus, elegant in its curves, represented vision, protection, and healing. Painted on coffins, inscribed on jewelry, it watched over the living and the dead alike. The scarab beetle, tirelessly rolling its ball across the earth, became the emblem of the rising sun, forever renewing. To where its image was, to carry the promise of rebirth. Even colors were alive with meaning. Gold shimmered as the flesh of the gods, eternal and incorruptible. Green symbolized life and renewal. Black, the fertile soil of the Nile, meant rebirth itself. In every line, every hue, every sacred image, Egyptians carried the conviction that their lives were woven into eternity. The Djed pillar, tall and ribbed, stood as the backbone of Osiris himself, a symbol of resilience and permanence. Alongside the ankh, the scarab, and the eye of Horus, it formed part of a sacred visual vocabulary. Egyptian art was never decoration alone, it was function. Magic carved in stone and pigment. Every image, every figure, every stroke of color carried intention. Red evoked vitality and danger, the restless spark of energy. Green meant life, growth, and the renewal of spring. Black reflected the fertile silt of the Nile, the color of rebirth itself. Gold was the brilliance of eternity, the untarnished flesh of the gods. Even proportions followed divine rules. A pharaoh's image was not a likeness of his face, but a declaration of eternal kingship. Gods were drawn in ideal form so that their presence could be sustained through art, architecture. Two echoed this sacred order. Pyramids aligned with constellations, stairways of stone rising toward heaven. Temples were arranged to capture the light of solstices, so that the sun itself became part of the ritual. Obelisks thrust skyward like frozen rays of Ra. Tombs carved into cliffs bore paintings of the soul's voyage through Duat, so that stone itself became a prayer for eternity. These monuments were not built for memory alone. They were living engines of devotion, sustaining the gods and preserving balance. In every detail, from the towering pylons to the simplest charms worn by a child, myth was alive. It gave suffering meaning, labor purpose, and death hope. To the Egyptian, no action was small, for each gesture tied the mortal to the eternal, and beneath it all, flowing through the heart of the land, was the Nile. Its annual flood was more than water rising from distant rains. It was the pulse of creation. It was Hapi's gift, the breath of the gods moving through the world. Each field that blossomed, each stalk of wheat that ripened, each basket of fish drawn from its waters was a miracle renewed. The river was not just sustenance, it was eternity flowing across the earth. The thread that bound the people to life itself, bound the people to life itself. Farmers watched the river anxiously. A gentle rise brought joy, promise, and feast. Too low meant famine, too high meant destruction. Hymns were raised to Hapi, asking for balance, for kindness in the swelling waters. And when the flood was right, villages rejoiced. Families gathered in celebration. Children splashed in the waters. Priests poured offerings into the current. Joy and reverence were woven together, for in the Nile's rhythm the people saw their own, fragile yet enduring, ever threatened by chaos, ever safeguarded by devotion. In the villages, daily routines carried the same sacred pulse. The sowing of seeds, the grinding of grain, the weaving of linen, all were carried out under the gaze of the gods. Even the most ordinary acts were infused with reverence. Quiet rituals that tied households to the order of the cosmos. At dawn, families rose with the sun, greeting Ra's victory over Apophis with whispered prayers. A simple gesture, a hand raised to the light, a word of thanks was enough to acknowledge the god's triumph. Meals began with quiet offerings, a piece of bread, a sip of beer, set aside for the ancestors whose unseen presence guided and guarded the household. Mothers spoke blessings as they dressed their children, invoking Bastet to shield them from harm and Hathor to surround them with laughter and warmth in the fields. Farmers turned the soil while chanting words that had been spoken for centuries, aligning their labor with the rhythm of the gods. Craftsmen, shaping wood or stone, carved protective amulets into their work so that each tool, each ornament, carried both utility and prayer. Fishermen poured drops of wine or a fragment of fish back into the Nile as thanks, recognizing that the river gave life and must be honored in return. Even the simplest homes were sanctuaries of devotion. Above the doorways, the Eye of Horus was painted in bold strokes to keep envy and illness at bay. Small clay figures of Base, the dwarf god of joy and protection, were placed in sleeping rooms to drive away nightmares. Around children's necks, strings of beads and amulets swung lightly, warding off wandering spirits that might seek to trouble the vulnerable. In this way, no clear line divided the sacred from the ordinary. To live was to pray, and to work was to worship. Death, though ever near, was not met with dread, but with preparation. Even the poorest families saved what they could to honor their dead. A clay pot of beer, a basket of bread, or a handful of beads was placed in graves, offerings of care for the journey into Duat. Families returned to tombs with gifts, speaking aloud to the departed as though they sat nearby, and in a sense, they did. Ancestors were believed to walk invisibly alongside the living, able to hear and to help, if remembered with love for the wealthy. Tombs became painted houses of eternity. Walls bore vibrant scenes of daily life. Farmers plowing fields, fishermen casting nets, bakers tending loaves. These were not memories of what had been, but promises of what was to come. What was painted became real in the next world. A man who filled his tomb with images of fields would plow them eternally in the field of reeds. A woman whose walls showed music and feasts would forever hear the sound of flutes and laughter. The afterlife was not alien or distant. It was Egypt perfected, familiar yet eternal. A woman who painted herself with children on her tomb walls would in the eternal lands forever walk among her family. A fisherman who carved nets and boats would cast them again in the waters of paradise. In this way, art was not memory, but magic shaping destiny beyond death. Priests, guardians of sacred knowledge, oversaw the transition from life to eternity. The process of mummification was no mere preservation. It was a holy ritual that stretched over weeks. The body was washed in purifying waters, anointed with oils, dried with salts of the desert, then wrapped in linen that bore prayers between its folds. Each bandage was a spell, each knot a safeguard. Anubis, jackal-headed guide of the dead, was invoked at every step, ensuring the body remained whole and recognizable when the soul returned to it. Seat of thought and morality was carefully preserved, for it would face judgment in the halls of Osiris. Across the chest, priests placed scarabs engraved with protective words, "Do not testify against me." Ankh's eyes and amulets glimmered among the wrappings, each carrying a promise of protection. Coffins themselves were painted in brilliant colors, faces gilded in gold, so that the dead might reflect the eternal radiance of the gods. Texts, above all, were the true companions in death. The Book of the Dead, written on papyrus scrolls or etched upon stone walls, offered not stories but instructions. What words to speak when confronted by guardians, which names of gods to call, which rivers to avoid, which gates to pass. To recite them was not mere memory, it was magic. The words enacted reality. To die without them was to risk wandering lost in Duat, without light, without direction. The Egyptian vision of the soul was rich and layered. The a bird with a human head, could fly freely, leaving the tomb by day to visit loved ones before returning by night. The the life force, needed nourishment, and so families brought bread, beer, and flowers to tombs, sustaining the soul through offerings. The the blessed spirit, was radiant, shining among the stars once judgment had been passed. Together, these aspects ensured that life did not end, but transformed. Without proper rites, the soul might become restless, a wandering ghost, troubling the living and seeking what it lacked. But with them, it rose joyfully to the field of reeds, where crops grew tall and the Nile flowed forever. There, beneath Ra's endless light, the just would live in harmony, free of hunger, free of fear. For the Egyptians, eternity was not a dream, but a certainty, carefully prepared for, lovingly imagined, endlessly renewed. This understanding of life and eternity shaped Egyptian society profoundly. To act justly was to ensure salvation. To uphold Mat was to preserve both community and personal destiny. Injustice threatened not only the state, but the very order of the cosmos. Pharaoh's role was to guard Mat on a grand scale. Each individual's role was to live by it daily. This sense of responsibility gave Egyptian culture remarkable stability. For millennia, the same values, symbols, and rituals endured, binding generations into a shared continuity. Children were taught to speak truth, to honor their parents, to respect the gods, and to give measure for measure in trade. Farmers plowed not only for harvest, but for righteousness, knowing that honest labor echoed into eternity. Even small acts, offering a drink of water, speaking kindly to a stranger, were seen as ripples in the great balance. Even when invaders came, even when dynasties fell, the heart of belief persisted. Assyrians, Persians, and later Greeks all left their mark, yet Egypt's spiritual rhythm endured. Foreign rulers built temples to Egyptian gods, adopted their rituals, and sought legitimacy through their myths. To rule Egypt was not merely to wield power, it was to take on the sacred duty of Pharaoh, protector of Mat. Such was the resilience of this worldview. It absorbed and adapted, but never vanished. Gods took on new forms, languages shifted, kingdoms rose and crumbled, yet the eternal order still pulsed beneath. Egyptian religion was not fragile faith, but a system woven into every sunrise, every river flood, every heartbeat of the land. The reach of Egyptian belief extended far beyond its borders. Traders carried amulets, scarabs, and ankhs across the Mediterranean. Sailors whispered prayers to Isis as they crossed uncertain seas. In bustling ports, foreigners marveled at obelisks and temples that seemed to touch the sky. Stories of Osiris and Horus mingled with local legends, reshaping myths far from the Nile. Greek and Roman writers described Egypt as a land of wisdom, its priests as keepers of secret truths. They told of hidden chambers within temples, of mysteries whispered only to initiates, of scrolls containing knowledge of the stars and the soul. For philosophers, Egypt was more than a place, it was a symbol of ancient truth, a fountain of magic, science, and philosophy. Even today, echoes remain. The ankh is worn as a symbol of life. The eye of Horus appears as a charm of protection. The pyramids still rise, their angles aligned with the heavens. Hieroglyphs carved thousands of years ago are studied as both art and sacred text. To walk among these monuments is to feel the weight of time, yet also the continuity of belief. Egypt, then, was not only a civilization of stone and sand, but of spirit. Its vision of the cosmos, order woven from chaos, eternity flowing through every breath, still speaks across the ages. To imagine living there is to imagine a life inseparable from myth. Each dawn would be sacred, each act a ritual, each choice a step toward eternity. And in this, perhaps, lies the true secret of Egypt's endurance, a belief not confined to temples or priests, but carried in the hearts of its people, alive in every generation. As eternal as the Nile, the Eye of Horus appears in jewelry, art, and even modern iconography. The pyramids, silhouetted against desert skies, inspire awe and speculation. Myths of resurrection, judgment, and eternal life resonate in cultures worldwide, shaped by the voices of the Nile. For the Egyptians themselves, however, these were not mere symbols, but reality. To them, gods walked with mortals, the dead conversed with the living, and eternity was as close as the sunrise. Their world was alive with meaning, infused with myth at every step. To walk along the Nile was to walk in the shadow of gods. To see the sunrise was to witness Ra's triumph. To act justly was to uphold Mat. To die was to journey, not to end. It is this vision of life as sacred, of death as transition, of eternity as certainty, that gave their civilization its endurance. Their myths, far from fading, still whisper to us across time, inviting us to step into their world, to see through their eyes, to believe as they believed that nothing truly ends, but all is renewed in the great rhythm of existence. The gods of Egypt were not distant abstractions, but companions woven into the cycles of existence. Each deity held both cosmic power and personal intimacy, shaping nature while also guiding individuals. To speak their names was to invite presence. To carve their images was to grant them a vessel in the world. Ra-Fe, the great sun god, dominated the pantheon as the giver of light and life. His journey across the sky was the heartbeat of time itself. Each sunrise was a triumph, each sunset a passage into mystery. At night, he traveled through Duat, guarded by gods and defended against Apophis. Without his victory, dawn would never return. For Egyptians, to greet the sun was to witness living proof of resilience. They saw themselves as allies in his battle. Their prayers and rituals strengthened his hand against the serpent of chaos. Osiris, though Lord of the Dead, embodied life. His green skin reflected vegetation and renewal. His white garments spoke of purity. His crown symbolized sovereignty. His myth of death and resurrection gave hope to all who faced mortality. In Osiris, Egyptians found assurance that death was not annihilation, but transformation. His throne in the underworld was not a place of terror, but of justice, where souls found what they deserved. Families prayed to join him, believing his reign was benevolent and eternal. Isis, his consort, was more than mother and wife. She was magic itself, the healer, the protector, the one whose devotion overcame death. Her image, with Horus on her lap, became an eternal symbol of nurturing, echoed in cultures far beyond Egypt. Her prayers were whispered by mothers, sailors, and kings alike. She was called the Great Enchantress, for her words bound reality itself. In her myth, devotion was not weakness, but strength. Love was not passive, but triumphant. Her son, Horus, the falcon-eyed god, spread his wings over Egypt as the protector of kingship. Every pharaoh claimed to be his incarnation, ensuring the throne was guarded by divine will. His struggle against Seth, the force of chaos, was retold endlessly in temples and rituals. Each retelling was more than memory, it was renewal. By affirming Horus's victory, Egyptians affirmed their own hope that order would prevail. And yet, even Seth, the rival and trickster, was never erased. He embodied storms, deserts, and violence, forces that could not be destroyed, but only contained. In some myths, he stood beside Ra, defending the sunboat against Apophis. This paradox revealed the truth at the heart of Egyptian belief. Chaos was not the enemy of order, but its shadow, necessary, dangerous, and always in need of balance. In this interplay of gods, myths, and symbols, Egyptians found meaning not only for their world, but for the universe itself. To them, existence was not random. It was woven from story, sustained by ritual, and protected by devotion. Their pantheon was not distant from humanity, but interwoven into its breath and rhythm, divine companions, guardians, and mirrors of the eternal Horus. Her son symbolized victory over chaos. His falcon eyes saw all, his wings spanned the sky. As avenger of Osiris, he embodied righteous struggle, perseverance, and triumph. Pharaohs drew legitimacy from him, believing they ruled as Horus incarnate. To oppose Pharaoh was to oppose the falcon god himself. To honor Horus was to affirm the endurance of order. Seth, though demonized in certain myths, was more complex than villain alone. He was desert storms, wild force, unpredictable danger. Yet he was also protector of Ra, spear in hand, standing at the prow of the solar bark to strike upon. Chaos wasn't only enemy, but necessity, a force that tested, a challenge that made order meaningful. Seth's worship reflected this duality. Feared, yes, but also respected. Without opposition, there could be no balance. His name whispered the truth that life was not harmony without conflict, but harmony achieved through it. Anubis guided souls through peril, his black jackal head watching the threshold. He embodied care and precision, embalming bodies to ensure recognition, weighing hearts to ensure fairness. He was not cruel, but impartial, ensuring that each soul received truth. His presence gave families comfort, for they knew their dead were not abandoned, but guided. To see a priest in jackal mask was not horror, but reassurance. Anubis was near, steady, vigilant, the first guardian of eternity. Thoth represented wisdom's calm. He measured time, recorded deeds, mediated disputes. His ibis head looked thoughtful, his pen poised. He invented hieroglyphs, the sacred writing that carried prayer into eternity. In his presence, chaos became calculation, anger became reason, memory became law. He was not warrior, but counselor, ensuring balance through words and numbers. Scribes prayed to him before setting ink to papyrus. Astronomers honored him as keeper of the stars. Priests invoked him when the calendar was set, when rituals were timed, when order required precision. He was believed to stand beside the scales of judgment, recording verdicts with unshakable accuracy. No lie escaped his pen, no truth went unmarked. In stories, he mediated quarrels even among gods, restoring harmony where rage threatened to tear creation apart. To Egyptians, Thoth was living proof that wisdom could overcome force, that writing could bind eternity, and that thought itself was divine. In this pantheon, each god played a role in the great theater of existence. Some ruled the sky, some guarded the underworld, some dwelt in rivers, deserts, or hearths. Together, they formed not a hierarchy of one above all, but a balance of powers, each necessary, each eternal. To live in Egypt was to live among them, to know their presence in wind and flood, in prayer and dream, in death and rebirth. Hatherer's laughter filled shrines with joy. She was music, dance, love, and beauty. Her sister rattled away sorrow. Her embrace comforted both the living and the dead. She was goddess of the sky and of the hearth, of celebration and of tenderness. To honor her was to affirm life's sweetness, to admit that joy was sacred. Even death was softened in her arms, for she welcomed souls into eternity with gentleness. Sekhmet roared with fury, lioness unleashed from Ra's fire. She toppled armies, spread plague, and blazed with divine wrath. Yet she was also healer. Her priests, doctors who knew herbs, spells, and remedies. She embodied life's fiercest paradox. The same power that destroyed could restore. Festivals of intoxication were held to soothe her rage. Music and beer transforming her fire into warmth. In her duality, Egyptians saw truth. Danger and cure were twins. Destruction and renewal inseparable. Bastet purred with serenity, sea-headed goddess of home and protection. She was beloved in households where cats prowled, not only as hunters but as divine companions. To stroke a cat was to touch her blessing. To harm one was unthinkable, for Bastet's wrath was as fierce as her tenderness was gentle. She reminded people that love itself was protective, that warmth could guard as surely as claws. Hapi swelled the river each year, his plump body flowing with abundance. He was celebrated with hymns of gratitude, his waters seen as lifeblood of Egypt. In him, Egyptians recognized the rhythm of survival, lean years and fertile years, scarcity and bounty, all within his flow. To honor Hapi was to honor life's dependence on cycles, to admit gratitude for every harvest. Mayat, feather on her head, wings spread wide, was the principle that bound all. She was truth, justice, harmony, the balance between opposites. Without her, gods and men alike would falter. Pharaoh offered her image to other gods, proving his devotion to order. Judges swore by her. Families taught her 2 children. Priests invoked her at rituals. In death, her feather decided fates. In life, her presence guided honesty, fairness, and balance. The pantheon was vast, yet cohesive. Every god held a role, every role a place in the grand design. To Egyptians, divinity was not a hierarchy of rivals, but a web of forces, cooperating, clashing, renewing. Myths explained relationships, conflicts, and reconciliations, showing that even among gods, balance was achieved through struggle. Humanity's role was to mirror this balance, to live in harmony with gods and nature alike. In this worldview, nothing was accidental. A storm was Seth's roar, a flood Hapi's gift, a sunrise Ra's triumph, a good harvest Osiris's blessing. Even misfortune carried meaning, a lesson, a test, a reminder of Mahat's fragility, a reminder of Mahat's fragility. Life was sacred theater, and each person a participant in its drama. Such beliefs gave Egyptians profound resilience. Famine, war, or invasion did not erase their faith. Instead, they turned to their myths for understanding, seeing hardship as part of the eternal struggle of order against chaos. Their rituals reaffirmed hope, their prayers restored confidence. Through millennia, their culture endured, not by chance, but by conviction that the cosmos itself was on there. To step into the sacred landscape of Egypt was to step into a living myth. The desert stretched vast and silent, yet it was not barren in Egyptian imagination. It was the domain of Seth, the god of storms and disorder. The fertile valley of the Nile, green and abundant, belonged to Osiris, lord of renewal. The horizon, where the sun rose each morning, was the realm of Ra, reborn daily. Every place carried divine identity, every landmark a story. Temples rose as mountains of stone, designed not simply as places of worship, but as embodiment of the cosmos. Their pylons were the horizon, their floors the earth, their ceilings the starry sky. Painted across these ceilings were constellations, goddesses stretching as celestial maps. Within these walls, the sacred was tangible. Hieroglyphs lined every surface, not as writing alone, but as spells, words alive with Heka sustaining the gods themselves. Priests carried out daily rites with precision, believing that neglecting even the smallest offering could endanger the balance of the universe. They awoke statues of gods at dawn, washed them, clothed them in linen, adorned them with jewelry, and set food before them. These were not symbols, but necessities. The gods were present in their statues, dependent on such care. In return, they blessed the land, its people, and Pharaoh. Pharaoh's role was central. He was Horus in life, Osiris in death, the axis around which Egypt turned. His responsibility was immense: to uphold Ma'at, to ensure that temples functioned, that rituals were performed, that enemies were subdued, and that chaos was held at bay. His image carved into temple walls was not vanity, but sacred duty, showing him smiting foes, feeding gods, maintaining order. Festivals brought myth to life for the people. During the beautiful feast of the valley, families visited tombs, bringing food and flowers, uniting the living and the dead. During Opet, statues of Amun, Mut, and Konu were carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor, accompanied by music, dance, and rejoicing. These festivals were not mere holidays, but recreations of mythic events, renewing divine presence among the people. Even ordinary households mirrored these beliefs. In homes, shrines to ancestors stood alongside images of protective gods. Families poured libations, lit lamps, and spoke prayers. In sickness, charms were recited, amulets pressed to the skin, and appeals made to Sekhmet for healing. In childbirth, women invoked Tauret. In daily meals, portions were set aside for the Ka of the departed. Every corner of life was infused with divine connection. Myths themselves were not static. They evolved, reshaped by priests, retold by storytellers, reinterpreted by dynasties. In some tales, Horus was child of Isis alone. In others, of both Isis and Osiris. In some versions, Seth murdered Osiris outright. In others, he only trapped him. This fluidity did not weaken belief. It strengthened it, showing myths as living, adaptable truths. What mattered was not fixed detail, but enduring meaning, the triumph of order, the promise of renewal, the certainty of justice. The underworld texts reflected this adaptability. The Book of the Dead contained hundreds of spells, no to papyri alike, tailored to individual needs. Some emphasized protection, others navigation, others persuasion before the gods. The Amduat, describing Ra's nightly journey, was inscribed in royal tombs to ensure kings shared in the sun god's renewal. The coffin texts, painted on wooden coffins, democratized access to the afterlife, allowing non-royals to claim its promises. Each new collection expanded the mythology, ensuring it reached all levels of society. The Field of Reeds remained the ultimate goal. Here, the just lived eternally, plowing and reaping without toil, feasting without hunger, reuniting with family. It was not an escape from life, but its perfect continuation. Egyptians did not imagine eternal idleness, but eternal fulfillment, where work was joy, where family bonds never broke, where order never faltered. It was heaven, grounded in the familiar, sanctified by abundance. This vision shaped Egyptian resilience. In times of hardship, famine, or foreign rule, they trusted in the gods' order, believing that balance would be restored. Their myths provided explanation, comfort, and hope. A poor harvest was Seth's disruption. A victorious campaign was Horus's triumph. Each event, large or small, was framed within the cosmic story. It is for this reason that Egyptian culture endured for thousands of years, longer than almost any other. Its myths were not fragile tales, but frameworks of meaning, flexible yet eternal. Even as new rulers came, even as other empires rose and fell, Egypt remained itself, its identity preserved by its stories. Among the countless deities, some held places of especially deep affection in the Egyptian heart. Anubis, with his jackal head and sleek black form, was one of these. He was the guardian of thresholds, the companion of the dead, the master of embalming. To families, he was not a terrifying figure, but a protector who ensured their loved ones were not abandoned on the dangerous road to eternity. Rituals of mummification were performed in his name. Priests wearing jackal masks spoke sacred words as they wrapped bodies in linen, anointed them with oils, and placed charms in the folds. Each movement mirrored the work of Anubis himself, who was believed to watch over the process. His presence ensured the body would remain recognizable to the soul. He also stood in the Hall of Ma'at, overseeing the weighing of the heart. Without his fairness, judgment could not be trusted. To see his black figure was to see assurance. The soul would be guided justly. Hathor, by contrast, embodied joy and beauty. She was the coward goddess of love, music, and motherhood, and her temples resounded with laughter and song. Priestesses shook sister, dancers spun, and offerings of flowers and wine filled the air with fragrance. Hathor's presence softened sorrow, turned mourning into comfort, and gave sweetness to the rhythm of life. Mothers prayed to her for safe births, lovers for devotion, and communities for harmony. She was both celestial and intimate, a goddess of the heavens and the hearth. Thoth, calm and wise, guided thought and language, depicted with the head of an ibis, or sometimes a baboon. He was scribe of the gods, keeper of accounts, recorder of truth. To him was attributed the invention of hieroglyphs, those sacred pictures that bound sound and meaning. Writing was itself magic, a divine craft that preserved memory and commanded reality. Scribes prayed to him before setting reed pen to papyrus, seeking clarity and precision. Astronomers honored him for his mastery of the moon cycles, his regulation of time. In myth, he mediated disputes among gods, bringing peace where anger raged. He stood at the scales of judgment, noting each verdict, ensuring truth endured. Seek roared with lion's ferocity, born of raw fire. She was unleashed to punish rebellion, and her fury burned like the desert sun. Her breath was plague, her eyes destruction, yet even she held a healing hand. Priests of Psychment were skilled in medicine, channeling her energy into cures. Rituals sought to soothe her rage with music, laughter, and rivers of beer dyed red. In intoxication, she transformed her wrath. She was paradox, embodied devastation and salvation in one. Egyptians saw in her the reminder that power could both harm and heal, that destruction and renewal were inseparable forces of existence. Bastard, feline, and graceful balanced her. She was gentleness, protection, and warmth. In homes, cats prowled as her sacred companions, guarding against pests and evil. Families cherished them, believing they carried Best's blessing. Her temples were filled with offerings of bronze cats, testimony to devotion. She was beloved, yet her claws reminded all that tenderness could defend as fiercely as ferocity. The Nile itself was personified as Hapi, the plump god of abundance. Each year, as the river swelled, hymns rose to him in gratitude. He was shown with blue or green skin, breasts and belly full, symbolizing fertility. His gift was life itself. Without his waters, Egypt would wither. With them, it flourished. Farmers relied on his rhythm, planting when the flood receded, reaping when the fields grew rich. In him, Egyptians saw the constancy of renewal, the assurance that survival followed trust in cycles. Malkat stood beyond all as the principle of existence. She was both goddess and order, the balance that held heaven and earth together. Her feather crowned the scales of judgment. Her name was invoked by pharaohs as proof of legitimacy, by judges as foundation of fairness, by families as guide to daily life. To live in Mayat was to live rightly, honestly, harmoniously. Without her, the universe would collapse into Isfit chaos. With her, eternity endured. Pharaoh himself was the embodiment of this balance. He was not simply king, but God on earth, Horus in life, Osiris in death. His duty was cosmic, to uphold Mayat, defeat enemies, build temples, and sustain the gods with offerings. His image carved on walls showed him smiting foes, not as personal triumph, but as ritual act of restoring order. His coronation was more than political. It was divine confirmation that Horus reigned again. In his death, his tomb became stairway to eternity, ensuring his K continued to protect Egypt. The pyramids rose as monumental affirmations of this role. They were not simply tombs, but cosmic machines, aligning with stars, reflecting sunlight, embodying order. Within them, Pharaoh's body was preserved, his chamber filled with treasures and texts. Their very stones spoke of permanence, of humanity's grasp toward eternity. To gaze upon them was to see the axis of earth and heaven joined. Guarding them stood the Sphinx, enigmatic and eternal. Its leonine body and human face spoke of strength and wisdom combined. Though winds wore its stone, its gaze remained unbroken, watching centuries pass. Legends claimed it asked riddles, guarding knowledge. To Egyptians, it was protector of thresholds, sentinel of mysteries. Its silence carried power, reminding all who passed that eternity watched. In the heart of these beliefs lay magic, or hika. This was not superstition, but the energy of creation itself. Gods wielded it, and humans could access it through words, symbols, and rituals. Spells inscribed on amulets, spoken over wounds, sung in lullabies, carried real power. Writing was itself magical, each hieroglyph a force. There was no divide between religion and magic. Both were threads of one fabric. Through Hika, existence itself was sustained. Symbols gave form to these truths. The Ankh embodied eternal life. The scarab beetle rolled the sun across the sky, emblem of rebirth. The Jed pillar stood for Osiris's enduring stability. These were not ornaments, but prayers made tangible, carried, worn, carved, painted. Even colors held meaning. Gold as flesh of gods. Green is life, black as fertility, red as chaos and vitality. To live surrounded by symbols was to live enfolded in eternity. Daily life reflected this sacred tapestry. Farmers offered thanks for each harvest. Fishermen blessed their catch. Mothers whispered prayers over children. Craftsmen carved protective signs into furniture, clothing, and tools. Even in laughter and play, the gods were present, for joy was Hatherer's gift. In hardship, people turned to Sekhmet for healing, to Isis for protection, to Osiris for comfort. In every corner of existence, divinity was near. Through this integration, Egypt achieved extraordinary endurance. Dynasties fell, rulers changed, invaders came and went, but the essence of belief remained. It was flexible, absorbing new influences, yet eternal, preserving its core. Even when foreign powers ruled, they built temples to Egyptian gods, adopted rituals, and claimed legitimacy through Ma'at. The voice of the Nile never faded, whispering myths that bound people to eternity. Night over Egypt was as alive with meaning as day. The desert cooled, the stars burned clear, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a celestial river. To Egyptians, it was not emptiness, but the reflection of the Nile above, the heavenly twin of the earthly river. Souls of the blessed were imagined as stars, shining forever in the company of the gods. Nut, the goddess of the sky, arched her body above the world, her form studded with stars. Each night she swallowed the sun, and each dawn she gave birth to it again. Her consort, GB, lay beneath her as the earth, fertile and enduring. Between them, Shu held sky and ground apart, creating the space for life. This cosmic family shaped the Egyptians' understanding of the universe. Not abstract forces, but divine beings whose actions explained the turning of the world. Ra's nightly voyage through the underworld was central to this vision. In his solar bark, he sailed through 12 gates, each marking an hour of darkness. With him traveled gods, spirits, and protectors, guarding against pharaohs, the great serpent of chaos. At midnight, Ra united with Osiris, drawing strength from the Lord of the Dead. By dawn, renewed, he rose again into the sky. This cycle repeated endlessly, proof that death was never final, that renewal always followed. For Egyptians, this myth was not distant story, but daily reality. Each sunrise was proof that Ra had triumphed again, that light had prevailed. Their prayers, offerings, and rituals were thought to strengthen him in battle, aligning human devotion with cosmic necessity. To live faithfully was to ensure the sun's return, to participate in the victory of order over chaos. Creation myths reinforced this eternal renewal. In Heliopolis, it was told that autumn rose alone from the primordial waters of Nun, forming himself from nothing. He created Shu and Tefnut, who in turn gave birth to Gibi and Nut, whose children became Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephis. From them, the world unfolded, a divine genealogy explaining all. In Hermopolis, 8 deities called the Hogdoid represented chaos itself, darkness, water, infinity, and hiddenness. From their union rose the primeval mound and the sun. In Memphis, Ptah, the craftsman god, created by thought and speech, conceiving the world in his heart and bringing it forth with his tongue. Each version reflected truth, not contradiction. For Egyptians, creation was not a single event, but a mystery retold in many ways. What mattered was not one story, but the assurance that the world arose from chaos into order, sustained by divine will. Every dawn, every flood, every harvest was recreation, proof that the cosmos endured. The concept of Mawat tied all together. She was balance, truth, and justice woven into creation itself. Without her, the gods could not function, nor the world endure. Pharaoh's duty was to uphold her, offering her image to the gods, ensuring order. In courts, judges swore by her. In homes, parents taught children her name. In the afterlife, her feather determined each soul's fate. To Egyptians, Ma'at was not abstraction, but the law of existence itself. Pharaoh embodied this cosmic duty. His rule was not simply governance, but participation in divine order. Each temple he built, each victory he claimed, was portrayed as triumph of Ma'at over his order, over chaos. His daily rituals sustained the gods. His monuments aligned heaven and earth. In him, the people saw assurance that the cosmos remained balanced. Even in death, his preservation in tombs ensured continuity, his spirit guarding Egypt forever. The pyramids exemplified this role. Rising from desert sands, they were mountains of eternity, linking earth to sky. Their precision reflected cosmic order. Their orientation aligned with stars. Within them, texts and treasures ensured Pharaoh's passage to the afterlife, where he would join the gods and continue to protect his people. They were not only tombs, but eternal statements. Order endures. Pharaoh reigns, Egypt lives. The Sphinx stood as guardian of these truths. Its lion body symbolized strength, its human face wisdom. Together, embodying the ideal ruler, carved from stone, it watched centuries pass, its silence more powerful than words. To Egyptians, it was sentinel at the threshold, protector of mysteries, proof that eternity kept watch. In myths, magic Hika was the energy of creation itself. Even gods wielded it, and humans could share in it. Spells, amulets, and rituals were not superstitions, but tools of reality. To inscribe a hieroglyph was to call forth its power. To recite a formula was to shape events. Healing, protection, and transformation flowed through Heka in this way. Egyptians lived not only in a physical world, but in a magical one, where word and symbol carried weight equal to stone and water. Amulets embodied this belief. The Ankh gave eternal life. The scarab promised rebirth. The Djed offered stability. Worn, buried, painted, they were prayers made tangible. Each color, each material was chosen with care. Gold for divinity, faience for renewal, lapis lazuli for the heavens. To surround oneself with symbols was to weave protection and blessing into life. Daily practices mirrored this worldview. Farmers poured libations before planting. Fishermen returned part of their catch to the river. Craftsmen carved protective signs into their work. Families lit lamps before shrines, whispered prayers at dawn, left offerings for ancestors. Death was approached not with despair, but with preparation, ensuring that the soul would journey safely. Life itself was ritual, each act a thread in the fabric of eternity. This integration gave Egypt extraordinary resilience. For millennia, dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers came and went, but the myths endured. They were flexible, adapting to change, yet eternal in essence. Even when hieroglyphs were forgotten, pyramids eroded, and temples buried, the symbols survived. Their meanings echoed across cultures. The voice of the Nile still whispered, carrying the promise of renewal. The myths of Egypt were not only stories told in temples or inscribed on tombs. They lived in the rhythm of society itself. Every harvest, every festival, every coronation was part of the cosmic narrative. To Egyptians, time was cyclical, not linear. Each year repeated the same sacred events: the flooding of the Nile, the rising of Sirius, the festivals of gods. Through repetition, order was reaffirmed, chaos held back, and the promise of eternity renewed. Festivals brought this cycle to life. One of the most celebrated was the Opt Festival in Thebes. Statues of Amen, Mut, and Khonsu were carried from Karnak to Luxor in grand procession, traveling along the Nile or through decorated streets. Priests sang hymns, musicians played, dancers moved with rhythm, and people rejoiced. The festival symbolized the renewal of kingship, affirming the pharaoh's divine legitimacy. For the people, it was also joy, a time when the gods walked among them, bringing blessing and abundance. Another beloved celebration was the beautiful Feast of the Valley. Families crossed the river to visit tombs, bringing flowers, food, and drink. They honored ancestors, feasted among the dead, and reaffirmed bonds that death could not break. In this mingling of life and death, the departed were not gone, but continued to share in festivals, part of the eternal community. At Abydos, the mysteries of Osiris were enacted. Processions reenacted his death at the hands of Seth, the mourning of Isis, and his resurrection. Pilgrims came from across Egypt to witness and participate, believing that in joining the ritual, they too shared in Osiris's triumph over death. The ceremonies blended theater, devotion, and magic, making myth tangible, ensuring its truth renewed in each generation. In these festivals, the line between human and divine dissolved. The gods were not remote but present, carried in barks, touched by offerings, celebrated with song. People danced, prayed, and wept with them. Children learned the stories through participation, absorbing myths not from books but from living enactment. In this way, belief was passed on as experience, deeply woven into identity. Time itself was sacred. Egyptians measured it by celestial rhythms. The rising of Sirius heralded the new year. The cycles of the moon guided festivals. The path of the sun ordered days. Clocks of water and shadow marked hours. But these were not merely practical. They were symbolic, aligning human life with cosmic order. To measure time was to participate in Mahat, to keep life aligned with the universe. The architecture of temples reflected this sacred time. Their axes aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. At certain days, sunlight would pierce inner chambers, illuminating statues of gods. These moments were not accidents, but carefully engineered affirmations of harmony. They showed that temples were not static, but alive, participating in the cycles they represented. Even the smallest rituals reflected this worldview. Before eating, people offered the first morsel to ancestors or gods. Before journeys, they spoke prayers for protection. Before sleep, they recited charms against nightmares. In sickness, they invoked Segment or Best. In childbirth, Terrat life was filled with gestures of faith, each one binding daily acts to eternity. The Egyptian vision of the afterlife reinforced this cycle. Death was not final, but transformation, continuation in another realm. The Ba, the soul bird, flew by day and returned by night. The Ka, the life force, required sustenance through offerings. The Akashic, the blessed spirit, shone as a star. To neglect these was to risk unrest. To honor them was to ensure eternal life. Families sustained their dead through offerings, believing that memory and devotion kept spirits strong. In the hall of Mayat, each heart was weighed against the feather of truth. This was not only judgment, but renewal. To pass was to join the field of reeds, to live eternally in abundance. To fail was to vanish into nothingness. The scales gave moral weight to life, ensuring that actions mattered, that justice extended beyond death. In this vision, each person's choices contributed to the balance of the cosmos. Symbols guided this passage. Scarabs ensured rebirth. Ankhs, eternal breath. DJ pillar, stability. Tombs were inscribed with protective spells. Coffins painted with eyes to allow the dead to see. Amulets placed carefully among wrappings. These were not adornments, but tools necessary for survival beyond death. Without them, the soul risked peril. With them, it was armed for eternity. Such integration of life, death, and myth gave Egypt extraordinary continuity. While other civilizations rose and fell quickly, Egypt endured for millennia. Its stability was not only political or geographic, but spiritual belief in cycles, in renewal. In Ma created resilience. Change was absorbed, not feared, because cycles promised return. Even when chaos struck, order would rise again as Ra rose each dawn. Foreigners marveled at this endurance. Greeks and Romans wrote of Egypt as ancient, even in their time, a land of mysteries and wisdom. They told of priests guarding secrets, of temples filled with knowledge. They blended Egyptian gods with their own Isis, with Dir, Thoth, with Hermes, Osiris with Dionysus. Egyptian myth spread far, inspiring cults and philosophies. Its symbols crossed seas. Its ideas endured in new forms. Yet for Egyptians, the truth was simple. They lived in harmony with the Nile, the sun, and the gods. Their myths were not distant allegories, but living truths. They didn't ask whether Ra truly sailed the sky. They saw him rise each morning. They did not question Osiris's resurrection. They saw crops sprout after death in the fields. Their faith was affirmed daily by the rhythms of nature, proof that myth and life were one. To understand the Egyptians fully, one must appreciate how seamlessly they wove the divine into the practical. Their engineering, medicine, and governance were not apart from myth, but guided by it. For them, science and religion were not opposites, but reflections of the same truth. Take architecture. Temples and pyramids were built with astonishing precision. Stones weighing tons were cut, transported, and fitted so tightly that even centuries later they stand strong. But to Egyptians, this was not simply engineering, it was sacred geometry. Alignments with stars, solstices, and cardinal directions were deliberate, designed to mirror cosmic order. Every measurement was infused with symbolism. The act of building itself was a ritual, recreating the first mound that rose from primordial waters. Medicine, too, blended practicality and divinity. Egyptian physicians studied the body carefully, diagnosing diseases, setting bones, and prescribing herbs. Yet every cure was accompanied by prayer or spell, invoking cement, th, or Hathor. To heal was not only physical, but spiritual, for illness was often seen as imbalance, intrusion of chaos into order. The remedy restored harmony both in flesh and in soul. Amulets were placed on the sick, chants recited, herbs applied, all part of a holistic practice that saw health as mayat within the body. Law and governance reflected the same principle. Pharaoh ruled not merely as monarch, but as upholder of Mah. Judges swore to speak truth. Scribes recorded decisions with precision. Penalties sought balance rather than vengeance. Justice was cosmic as well as civic. To lie, cheat, or oppress was not only crime against neighbor, but disruption of the universe. The Hall of M in the afterlife mirrored the courts of earth, ensuring that what was done in life echoed in eternity. Art carried these beliefs into form. Statues of gods were not portraits, but vessels of presence. Proportions were based on sacred grids, ensuring harmony. Colors carried layered meaning: blue for the sky, green for life, gold for the eternal, black for regeneration. Even the smallest amulet was carefully crafted, embodying power. Art was not aesthetic alone, but magical, shaping reality. To depict something was to give it existence. To write words was to ensure they lived forever. Hieroglyphs were especially powerful. They were more than script, they were living images. Each symbol carried layers of meaning, sound, and essence. To carve them on stone was to anchor eternity. To write them on papyrus was to call spirits. To erase them was to destroy. Pharaohs often inscribed their names deeply, ensuring they could not be forgotten. Memory was survival. To be remembered was to live forever. Thus, writing itself was sacred, ritual. This belief in memory shaped culture. Tombs were houses of eternity, designed to preserve names, images, and offerings. Walls depicted scenes of life, ensuring continuity. Inscriptions called on the living to speak the name of the dead, for each spoken word renewed the spirit. Even the poorest sought modest graves, with names etched so that their souls would not fade. Immortality was tied not only to divine judgment, but to remembrance. The community played its part in sustaining this. Festivals to the dead brought families to tombs, carrying food and drink, speaking with ancestors, sharing stories. Offerings maintained the ka, the life force. Through this devotion, the boundary between living and dead dissolved. Ancestors protected descendants. Descendants honored ancestors. A cycle of care that extended beyond death. Even leisure and play reflected divine presence. Board games like Sinet were not only pastime, but symbolic journey through the afterlife, guiding pieces through obstacles toward renewal. Music echoed through homes and temples, instruments dedicated to Hathor or Bes. Dance was both joy and ritual, movement that honored the gods. Storytelling by lamplight passed myths to children, teaching values in ways they could feel and remember. Foreign contact expanded this worldview, but did not diminish it. Egyptians traded with neighbors, absorbed influences, and sometimes adopted foreign gods into their pantheon. Yet they interpreted all through their own lens, seeing foreign deities as forms of their own. To them, truth was universal, appearing under many names. This adaptability gave their religion resilience, allowing it to endure while others faded. Philosophers of later civilizations looked back on Egypt with awe. Greeks associated Th with Hermes, Isis with deer, Osiris with Dionysus with deer, Osiris with Dionysus. They spoke of Egypt as land of mysteries, where hidden knowledge was guarded by priests. Initiates sought wisdom in its temples, and legends of secret rites grew. Though much of this was romanticized, it reflected genuine admiration for Egypt's depth of vision. Even today, echoes remain. Symbols like the Ankh and Eye of Horus appear worldwide. Ideas of judgment after death, resurrection, and eternal life echo Egyptian belief. Their monuments inspire awe. Their myths fuel imagination. Their philosophy still whispers in modern thought. Egypt, though ancient, remains alive in memory. Its voice carried forward by stone, story, and spirit. To walk among its ruins is to feel this presence. Pyramids rising against the sky, hieroglyphs carved deep temples aligned with the sun. Each is testimony to a world-view that saw no separation between sacred and mundane. For Egyptians, everything was divine. Life was ritual. Death was renewal. Eternity was certain. Their myths, enduring for thousands of years, invite us even now to see the world as they did, alive with meaning, balanced by truth, sustained by devotion. The Egyptian cosmos was built on layers of meaning where natural phenomena, divine myths, and human actions mirrored each other. To live was to participate in this network of symbols. Nothing was random. Every star, every plant, every season carried spiritual resonance. The annual flooding of the Nile was perhaps the clearest example. Scientifically, it was caused by rains and distant lands, but Egyptians saw it as the tears of Isis, mourning Osiris, swelling the river. The flood was grief transformed into life. Sorrow turned into abundance. Farmers watched the waters rise with reverence, for in them they saw divine love sustaining the land. The receding flood left behind black silt, fertile as Osiris's rebirth, ensuring fields blossomed once again. Thus, agriculture was myth in practice, daily labor infused with cosmic truth. The stars, too, spoke of myth. Constellations were not abstract patterns, but gods and spirits. Orion was Osiris, eternal in the sky. Sirius was Isis, whose rising heralded the new year and the flood. The Milky Way was the heavenly Nile, across which souls traveled. To gaze upward at night was to read divine scripture written in light. Priests studied these stars not only for calendars, but for prophecy, believing they revealed the will of the gods. The sun's path was central to this vision. Each dawn Ra was born. Each dusk he died. Each night he sailed the underworld. Egyptians measured time by this cycle, structuring rituals around sunrise and sunset. At dawn, hymns awakened the world. At dusk, prayers protected it through darkness. The solar journey symbolized all life, birth, death, renewal. To watch the sun was to watch the story of existence unfold each day. Temples embodied this cosmic order. Their pylons framed horizons. Their halls mirrored marshes of creation. Their sanctuaries held the womb of renewal. Ceilings painted with stars made worshippers feel they stood beneath Nut's body. Floors carved with water lilies reminded them of the primeval waters. At special moments, solstices, equinoxes, the sun pierced inner chambers, flooding statues with light. These alignments proved temples were not only structures, but instruments linking heaven and earth. Pharaoh's role was to maintain this link. His rituals were not personal, but cosmic responsibilities. When he offered Mayat to the gods, he symbolically renewed the order of the universe. When he smoked enemies on temple walls, it was not mere propaganda, but myth enacted. Horus defeating Seth, order overcoming chaos. His very existence was axis of balance. Egyptians saw in him assurance that the cosmos endured. Festivals expanded this assurance to the people. During great processions, statues of gods left their sanctuaries, traveling on barks through streets or along the Nile. Crowds rejoiced. Music filled the air. Incense rose. The gods were not confined to temples, but present among their worshippers. These festivals collapsed the boundary between divine and human, allowing people to see, touch, and celebrate with their deities. In those moments, eternity touched earth. The afterlife was woven seamlessly into this world view. Death was transition, not end. The soul divided and multiplied. Ba, Ka, O, each with needs and powers. The Ba flew. The Ka required sustenance. The O shone among the stars. Funerary rituals ensured these parts remained whole, guiding the soul through trials. Mummification preserved the body. Tombs preserved memory. Offerings preserved the Ka. Without them, the soul risked dissolution. With them, eternity was assured. Judgment gave moral weight to life. In the hall of Maat, the heart was weighed against her feather. The gods watched. Anubis adjusted the scale. Thoth recorded, if the heart was light, the soul passed to bliss. If heavy, a meat devoured it. This vision ensured that choices mattered, that justice was eternal. It gave dignity to life, for even the poor could achieve eternity if their hearts were true. The field of reeds offered reward, a perfected Egypt where fields yielded without toil, families reunited, joy endured. Here life continued, not in abstraction, but in familiar abundance. To Egyptians, heaven was not distant paradise, but perfected home, proof that what was good in life was eternal. Magic or hikabound altogether. It was not trickery, but the power of creation itself, available to gods and humans. Spells protected children, healed wounds, guarded travelers. Amulets embodied divine presence, worn by living and buried with dead. Words spoken carried force. Images drawn carried reality. To speak was to act. To write was to create. In this worldview, language itself was sacred, bridging thought and being. Symbols gave tangible form to invisible truths. The ink for life, scarab for rebirth, Jed for stability, was scepter for power, Eye of Horus for protection. Each distilled meaning into form. They appeared in jewelry, art, tombs, and temples, saturating life with divine presence. Even color was symbolic. Red for danger and vitality, green for life, blue for eternity, gold for divinity. To surround oneself with symbols was to dwell in protection. Art and architecture preserved eternity. Walls depicted daily life, not for memory, but for continuation. To paint fishing was to fish forever. To carve banquets was to feast eternally. Statues housed allowing spirits to receive offerings. Obelisks rose like sunbeams frozen in stone, linking earth and sky. Pyramids aligned with stars, their geometry echoing cosmic order. Each work of art was functional, sustaining life, securing eternity. In this seamless blend of myth, ritual, and practice, Egyptians achieved remarkable continuity. For thousands of years, their worldview remained intact, absorbing change without breaking. Dynasties rose and fell, foreign rulers came, but the myths endured. Their adaptability was strength, their symbols eternal. Even when temples fell silent and hieroglyphs were forgotten, their voice persisted, carried through symbols and memory. To study Egypt today is to glimpse this enduring vision. It invites us to see life not as fragments, but as unity, to see cycles of nature as sacred, to treat justice, to honor memory as survival. The Egyptians remind us that existence itself can be seen as divine drama, where each Egyptian mythology was not isolated from the world around it. The Nile connected Egypt with lands to the south, east, and Mediterranean north, bringing goods, travelers, and ideas. Yet, Egypt absorbed these influences in its own way, filtering them through Maat and blending them into its myths. From Nubia came gold, ivory, and exotic animals, along with deities like Detonin, a god of wealth and incense. Egyptians respected Nubia as land of riches, often depicting it as source of abundance. Military campaigns there were justified in mythic terms, Pharaoh extending Horus's order over Seth's wilderness. Yet, Nubian gods were also honored in Egyptian temples, showing integration rather than rejection. From the Levant came trade in cedarwood, wine, and silver. Foreign princesses married into Pharaoh's court, bringing their customs and deities. Baal, Rashif, and Arti entered Egyptian pantheon, worshipped in temples as powerful gods of storm, war, and love. Egyptians did not see contradiction in this. They saw universal truth under different names. A foreign god could be form of Seth or Horus, Isis or Hathor. This openness gave their religion flexibility, absorbing without losing identity. To the west, Libyan tribes influenced Egyptian military and ritual practices. Deities like Nin, goddess of war and weaving, gained prominence, partly through Libyan connection. Later, dynasties of Libyan origin ruled Egypt, adopting its myths while adding their heritage. The system proved resilient, accommodating change while affirming continuity. To the north, Greece looked upon Egypt with fascination. As early as Homer, Egypt was described as land of wonders, wisdom, and healing. Greek travelers visited temples, marveled at pyramids, and wrote of priests with hidden knowledge. They associated Th with Hermes, merging them into Hermes Trismegistus, source of philosophy and alchemy. Isis was equated with Demeter and later worshipped across the Mediterranean as universal mother. Osiris was compared to Dionysus, god of death and rebirth. Egyptian myths thus spread far, shaping Greek thought and through it Western tradition. The Romans inherited this fascination. Cults of Isis thrived in Rome, Pompeii, and beyond, offering hope of salvation and eternal life. Temples dedicated to her stood beside those of Jupiter and Mars. Her image with Horus influenced depictions of Mary and Christ. Centuries later, Egyptian symbols crossed into new faiths, transformed yet recognizable. This reveals universal human desire to feel agency, to believe one's actions matter against chaos. The visual richness of Egyptian myth also satisfied psychological imagination. Gods with animal heads, monstrous guardians of the underworld, radiant solar barks, all created vivid mental images. These stirred awe and fear, embedding stories deeply in memory. Art, ritual, and narrative work together to engage mind and senses, making belief not only intellectual but experiential. Community reinforced this psychology. Festivals, rituals, and processions created collective joy and reassurance. To see gods carried through streets, to sing hymns with neighbors, to feast at tombs with family, all affirmed belonging. Religion was not solitary, but communal, weaving individuals into larger story. This social reinforcement strengthened endurance of myth across millennia. In essence, Egyptian mythology reveals a worldview profoundly human and profoundly cosmic. It addressed fears of death and chaos, offered justice and renewal, legitimized authority, and created community. It did so with extraordinary creativity, weaving symbols, rituals, and stories into a seamless vision. That vision endured because it spoke to universal needs, shaping identity not only for Egyptians, but for all who encountered their culture. Modern psychology finds echoes here. The archetypes described by Carl Jung, hero, mother, shadow, wise guide, are vividly present in Egyptian myth. Horus is hero, Isis the mother, Seth the shadow, Thoth the wise counselor. These archetypes recur across cultures, suggesting deep structures of human mind. Serapis, a fusion of Osiris and Greek deities, spread widely. Temples continued. Rituals, even under Roman rule. Hieroglyphs remained sacred, though fewer could read them. Myths persisted, evolving but never vanishing. This adaptability came from myth's symbolic nature. Since details were fluid, meanings could shift. Ra could merge with the moon to become a lunar Ra, supreme creator whose light never truly vanished. Pita could rise in Memphis as the craftsman god, shaping the cosmos through the power of thought and speech. Horus could be depicted as a vulnerable child upon Isis's lap, as a falcon soaring above the skies, or as a king embodying justice. Each form carried truth. None excluded the others. This pluralism gave Egyptian religion its resilience, allowing it to embrace diversity without shattering. For the Egyptians, the divine was not fixed in a single image, but infinite, flowing, ever adapting, like the Nile itself. Even as centuries passed and Christianity spread, many Egyptian ideas flowed into new forms. The tender image of mother and child, Isis and Horus, found reflection in Mary and Jesus. Beliefs in judgment, resurrection, and eternal life resonated with Christian teachings, familiar to a people already steeped in such visions. Monks in desert monasteries, practicing rigorous asceticism, echoed ancient traditions of retreat and devotion once offered to the gods. Though temples closed and hieroglyphs fell silent, Egypt's spiritual voice was not lost. It continued, whispered in new languages and symbols. When modern explorers rediscovered Egypt, the fascination ignited anew. Napoleon's scholars mapped temples and copied inscriptions, carrying fragments of eternity back to Europe. When Champollion cracked the code of hieroglyphs, Egypt spoke again after centuries of silence, revealing prayers, contracts, poetry, and spells long entombed. In the Victorian age, mummies were unwrapped under flickering gaslight, their wrappings rustling like voices from the grave, their presence igniting both science and superstition. Egypt became a theater of imagination, its pyramids mysteries unsolved, its pharaohs half-remembered kings of legend. Its myths soon entered novels, paintings, films, and even fashion. The curse of the pharaohs haunted Western minds. The pyramids, silhouetted against desert skies, became icons of endurance. Cleopatra, last of the Ptolemies, was reborn endlessly in poetry, theater, and cinema as the face of Egypt itself, seductive, intelligent, eternal. Ancient stories found modern lives still resonant after millennia, reshaped to meet new needs. This endurance reveals something profound. Myths need not be literal to be true. Egyptians themselves knew this instinctively. They told multiple versions of the same tale, accepted contradictions without discomfort, and emphasized meaning over detail. Truth, for them, was not a fixed point, but a living flame, shifting yet undying. Their myths were living symbols, renewed with each telling, each ritual, each sunrise over the Nile. That is why they endured, and why they still speak to us today. To listen to them is to enter a worldview of resilience, justice, and renewal. They remind us that chaos is always near, but never final. That truth and balance are worth striving for, even against storm and shadow. That death is not an end, but a transformation, a passage to light. They offer us a vision of life as sacred cycle, eternity as certainty, humanity as participant in a cosmic story that began long before us and will continue long after. In their myths, the Egyptians left us not only history, but wisdom whispers from the Nile, still flowing across time, calling us to remember that we, too, are part of the eternal rhythm.